Hey pirate fans around the world. This is Treasure of Lima, the Phantom Fortune. Still driving seekers. As Lima reeled, a convoy's sacred gold and jewels vanished. A mutinous crew whispered of an island vault. 2 centuries later, maps, myth, and modern tech still chase a fortune no one can prove or dismiss. Picture a capital city under strain, a harbor choked with rumor, and a cargo so dazzling that even its guardians could not agree on its true value. The tale promises a vanished colonial fortune, a captain accused of betraying crown and clergy, and an island said to swallow expeditions as easily as the sea swallows footprints in the surf. Tonight's story tracks the money, the maps, and the modern hunts. Calmly, clearly, and with receipts where they exist. The payoff is simple by the end. The strongest clues will be separated from the sweetest legends, and the listener will have a clean sense of what might still wait in the Pacific night. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with pirate stories whenever you want. The legend called the Treasure of Lima lives at the intersection of wealth and wonder. In its most common telling, it includes church plate, the heavy gold and silver that once flashed under cathedral light, royal gifts sent across oceans to celebrate a colony's faith, bullion refined into neat stackable bars, and jewels mounted in sacred effigy. Quick fact: in the early 19th century, church plate could mean chalices, monstrances, candlesticks, and 100 smaller ornaments, not just stacked ingots. This isn't a single chest lifted with a grunt and a cheer. This is a shipment that would have filled a ship's waist with wooden crates, padded with wool or straw, tallied by nervous clerks who counted by weight, not by gleam. Why it matters now is half arithmetic, half emotion. Arithmetic first. Gold has a market price that rises and falls, silver the same, and gems rise even more when cut, mounted, and given a story. Emotion next. People remember what was blessed, what was hoisted on feast days, what was kissed by generations who believed. When rumor says such things were seized for safety and then lost, it combines anxiety about war with the magnet of the sacred. That blend multiplies attention. The alleged value swells with each retelling, not because someone adds more crates, but because modern ears add more zeros. A listener can picture a glittering statue of the Virgin set with emeralds. A historian will ask, which statue recorded where, weighed how much? Legend, contested, attested labels will keep this journey grounded. It helps to step into the present tense. Documentary crews pitch tents where mosquitoes rule. Private expeditions charter ships, brief divers, and check barometers. Governments put signatures on permits and flags on beaches to mark protected ground. Park rangers carry both maps and patience. In this moment, somewhere someone is tracing a line across a chart from Lima to a small green dot, convinced that technology will finally end an old argument. The hook of the Treasure of Lima then is not simply a vault of gold imagined beneath roots and lava. The hook is that the story stays plausible, while refusing to resolve, like a door that never quite closes. Let's take it step by step. The backdrop is the crisis in Peru, around 1820 and 1821. Armies marched, a new political future, pressed hard against the old. Royalists faced with shifting control and short horizons, thought like managers in a house on fire. Move the valuables, keep them safe, wait for the flames to settle. Ports matter in such moments. Callao, the harbor for Lima, had warehouses, cannon, and officials who understood both the ledger and the sword. When towns change hands, assets move, some by decree, some in panic, some in secrecy. That churn creates a stage where honest convoys and illicit plans share the same corridors. Attested records show valuables were transferred out of threatened cities in this period for safekeeping. Contested, the exact composition and weight of any single shipment, later called the Treasure of Lima. A transport decision sets this entire legend in motion. The tale tells of selecting a ship that could pass as neutral, putting the cargo on board, and sending it seaward under escort. If true, that choice opened more doors than it closed. Neutral flags could slip where warships hesitated. But they also placed a fortune in the hands of a captain and crew, who were loyal to pay and opportunity more than to crown or clergy. A convoy in theory and in paper becomes, in practice, a set of human hearts prone to fear, greed, and sudden bargains. Now the core of the story. The vessel most often named is the Mary Dear. The narrative paints its captain, its officers, and the guards placed aboard. The next scene is mutiny. The crew turns, the guards are murdered, and the cargo is diverted. The whispers say that the ship paused at a remote Pacific island, a place lush, volcanic, and ringed with anchorages that look made for hiding, to bury the crates and mark the spot. Legend puts a dagger in the sand and a promise in the air. But every strong legend carries a counterweight. What happened next is told in a tangle. Capture accounts say the mutineers were taken, executions followed, and a survivor promised to lead authorities back to the cache. But even those accounts conflict on names, dates, and the one thing everyone craves, the exact island. Myth check. Mary Dear mutiny, an island cache. Legend with contested details. Executions of mutineers in connection with a treasure theft, attested in multiple retellings, but the documentary paper trail is thin and uneven. A careful listener notes that confession stories often bloom after the rope tightens. "I can lead you to it" is the oldest currency desperate men ever offered. What was allegedly aboard? Here, the imagination loves to sprint, while the historian insists on walking. The lists are familiar: altarpieces, gem-laden statues, bars of gold and silver, reliquaries set with small brilliant stones, bags of coins bearing royal effigies. Which of these are theatrical and which plausible? Plausible. A high-value church shipment including chalices, candlesticks, processional crosses, and bullion. Plausible. Reliquaries and jewels listed on ecclesiastical inventories. Theatrical. Perfectly preserved life-size golden statues casually crated like firewood. Heads up on this. Churches in the era routinely maintain detailed inventories, but such records, even when they survive, may not travel neatly to the dock. Wartime transfers can separate lists from loads. Translating period lists into modern value ranges without hype means thinking in weight and provenance, not in headlines. Priceless is a word curators use when an object is sacred, unique, and culturally important. Its market value fades behind the fact that selling it would be sacrilege. If such items truly entered the stream of contraband, their fate would be uglier than any romantic tale. Gems pried loose, gold melted, inscriptions destroyed to erase identity. That's why the image of a buried cache appeals. It preserves identity and hope that the items might someday be returned as themselves. Roots and geography matter more than poetry. From Lima and Callao toward Panama, the sea lanes tick like a metronome along the coast, then arc out to catch currents and winds. A realistic captain, honest or crooked, thinks in days to water, days to coal. Well, in that era, days to fresh water and anchorages, swell direction, and patrol zones. Why would a thief steer not for a city, but for a remote island? Logic favors a short-term cache, a place where crew can land, dig, hide, and leave quickly, then return later when heat and attention have cooled. An uninhabited outcrop with dense cover and fresh streams, far from busy trade, makes an excellent hiding place, but a terrible vault if the plan requires years. Quick fact: on rain-lashed volcanic islands, soil slumps, rivers rewrite courses, and landslides do not care about human maps. A cache dug hurriedly in a dry month can be under a new creek by the next season. A map moment. The eye jumps from Lima northward along the spine of the Pacific, then outward toward oceanic parks, where rangers count nesting birds and divers chase hammerhead shadows. An island that looks like a quiet dot on paper is, on the ground, valleys of fern, ridges of mud, and ridgelines where a careless boot slides a yard with each step. Everyone asks about paper trails. Documents, dispatches, and claims exist, but they vary in quality like coins pulled from a beach. Some sharp, some eaten away. Shipping logs, church inventories, colonial correspondence, court records, and later retellings share shelf space in archives and private collections. Historians weigh inconsistent testimony the way a captain weighs cargo, carefully with an eye for water damage and clever forgery. Solid dates anchor the early 19th century crisis and the movement of wealth away from hot zones. Less solid are the specific ledger lines that attach a precise list to a single voyage that then vanishes into mutiny. Attested inventories of sacred objects moved for safeguarding as power shifted. Contested whether those objects were ever placed on the very ship named in the legend. Here a calm ear helps. When an account written decades after the events includes perfect dramatic dialogue and a neat promise to guide a new expedition, it belongs in the contested basket until paired with earlier independent sources. Early pursuits created the template for disappointment. As soon as rumors of a confession circulated, claimants appeared with maps, some drawn with obsessive cross-hatching, others with a few hastily sketched landmarks and an X that seemed to have landed there by fate. Small teams went ashore, followed streams, and dug where the mud looked disturbed to hopeful eyes. They came back with stories of old campfires, odd stones, and sometimes coins, single coins, scattered, the sort that any island with human visitors collects like pocket lint. Those early hunts failed for predictable reasons. They were led by stories rather than surveys. They trusted dying men's promises more than topography, and they underestimated how rain, roots, and gravity conspire to erase human intentions. Yet their letters and newspaper notes taught a pattern that repeats for 2 centuries. The first rush of optimism, the rumor that a guide knows the true spot, the trench opened with ceremony, and the quiet return to the boat as night falls and rain begins. Then came the long-haul searchers, the ones who simply moved in. An archetype took root, the resident treasure hunter, part historian, part hermit, who stayed for years among insects and storms. Such figures mapped more than they dug. They learned the terrain like a farmer learns a field, where the morning mists hang, where wild pigs root up soil, where a decades-old landslide left a scar and a hidden pocket. They found small things, coins, a buckle, a length of chain. Attested, resident searchers on likely islands did recover stray objects and build networks of paths and trenches. Contested, whether any of those finds directly tied to the specific treasure invoked by the legend. Living on site taught lessons that armchair maps never give. Rains that begin as a soft hiss can, within an hour, punch gullies into sand. Tree roots can embrace a buried crate until wood and root become one puzzle no shovel solves. A cache buried in haste could, without any drama, turn into a cavity that collapses, leaving no surface sign. Heads up on this, lost to nature is not a romantic escape clause. It is the default state of anything the jungle is allowed to touch. Entangled legends complicate matters, separate pirate tales. Other captains, other hordes, crash this party like rowdy guests who insist they were invited. An island famous for one rumor becomes a magnet for every other. Claims multiply. A different treasure from a different decade was buried just a valley away. A separate map shows a skull-shaped rock. Another diary mentions a king's ransom hidden on the same shore. Distillation helps some elements plausibly overlap. Busy routes, favored anchorages, shared watering spots. Others are late graphs, a colorful nickname dropped in by storytellers decades later to add spice. Myth check. When a single island plays host to 3 or 4 distinct buried fortunes, the law of averages and the law of human mischief both raise eyebrows. The clean approach labels overlapping claims as possible collisions of history, while marking most editions as legend graphs. Unless anchored by early sources, the 20th century gilded the hunt with personalities. Yachts, millionaires, and newspaper fever turned quiet expeditions into theater. Reporters loved photographs of men with shovels next to holes. Investors dressed in crisp whites smiled beside crates of dynamite, convinced that force would triumph over patience. Publicity shaped where shovels went toward the most photogenic coves and the most dramatic cliffs. Not always toward the best geological bets, the map industry blossomed. Forged charts stained with tea to look old, embellished diaries with just enough detail to feel right, and a cottage market in clues sold to the hopeful. Attested forged and embellished maps entered circulation around famous treasure legends, contested whether any of the most cherished charts for this particular story trace back to genuine early witnesses. Quick fact: genuine early maps care more about soundings and anchorages than skulls and arrows. A map with perfect calligraphy and an X in the center is often a stage prop. Modern technology brought new confidence against old resistance. Sonar sweeps outline seabeds where anchors might have been cut or crates might have slipped. Magnetometers sniff for large metal masses hidden under silt. ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, descend along slopes too dangerous for divers. LiDAR peels foliage off terrain in digital models, revealing terraces, trenches, and ancient landslides. These tools can do wonders on smooth, predictable ground. On rain-lashed volcanic islands and steep seabeds, they can also produce glorious false positives. A cluster of stones on a scan becomes, in a human mind, a pile of bars. A magnetic anomaly turns out to be a volcanic dike or an old anchor chain far from any fabled cache. Case studies teach humility. One project uses LiDAR to reveal abandoned agricultural plots, not treasure trenches, significant archaeology, but not a vault of gold. Another follows a strong magnetometer hit to a buried iron formation that pretended to be a chest. The lesson is not to scorn the tools, but to remember that tech amplifies both skill and bias. It will show what a seeker is ready to see unless controlled by careful method and a willingness to be bored by rocks. The law waits behind every trailhead. Permits and protected parks govern where and how anyone can dig. National park protections and UNESCO heritage principles exist to prevent cultural harm, which a treasure hunt, however romantic, can easily inflict. Digging without permits ends hunts before they start, sometimes with fines, sometimes with a simple escort back to a dock. Modern agreements attempt to split potential fines between states, investors, and claimants, but the pie chart never pleases everyone. Imagine a sacred chalice recovered from beneath roots. Church authorities may argue it must return to the altar or a museum. The state may assert national patrimony. Investors will cite risk and cost. Heads up on this: in many jurisdictions, artifacts of high cultural value cannot be sold privately at all. In practice, anyone serious about recovery enters a long hallway of paperwork before taking a single spade to soil. That is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is a guardrail against the loss of context, which is the first casualty of unregulated digging. Competing theories of location divide the conversation like tides around a reef. The island vault theory holds that the mutineers made landfall on a remote, uninhabited island to stash the cargo, counting on secrecy and distance to protect it. The mainland theory suggests that inland stashes, monasteries, haciendas, or caves above floodlines offered better concealment with better chances of quiet retrieval. Evaluating the options demands a cool look at travel times, crew size, cargo weight, and the concealment window. A stack of bullion is heavy, but movable with enough backs and hours. Sacred objects are bulky and delicate. Crates must be lifted and handled with care. If the mutiny occurred far from the mainland, an island stop was not just plausible, but necessary for rest and water. If time windows were short and patrols likely, an inland trek may have been prohibitively slow and conspicuous. The rank ordering that emerges for many analysts is simple: short-term island cache for heat relief, then a plan to move selected items later to safer, more permanent ground. Plans break, weather intervenes, confidants die. A good plan can freeze into a forever secret when one piece fails. Counting the fortune turns romance into arithmetic. How heavy would the whole be? A single gold bar in that era could weigh around a dozen troy pounds or more. But bars varied. A crate might carry several dozen. Multiply by many crates and add silver, which is less dense than gold but often present in larger bulk. Add the mass of candlesticks and chalices. Hollow, yes, but not weightless. Now add the awkward volume of gem-laden effigies, which cannot be stacked like bricks. A rough conservative estimate places the entire shipment as far beyond what a handful of men could move in a single landing party. That means trips. Trips mean time. Time invites patrols and betrayal. A realistic timeline for hiding even a portion of it runs into many hours and likely multiple nights, even for a disciplined crew using leverage, sleds or improvised rollers. The window between mutiny and capture, if the capture tales are true, squeezes those hours further. This arithmetic does not kill the legend. It clarifies its possible shapes. If anything was buried, it was likely the most transportable, the most valuable per pound, and the most identifiable as loot if left aboard. Jewels and select gold perhaps, more than cumbersome silver, unless more hands were involved than the neat stories admit. Culture and commerce swirl around the legend like gulls around a trawler. Tours point to coves with stories attached. Paperback adventures promise a final clue on the last page. Entrepreneurs sell authentic maps and secret diaries that look delicious in candlelight and dissolve under daylight scrutiny. Red flags in Two Perfect Discoveries are easy to memorize. If a find is announced with dramatic flourish but offers no verifiable coordinates, no peer-reviewed report, and no independent witnesses, caution is the ballast that keeps the mind upright. Famous hoaxes are not a stain on the dream. They are a reminder that hope is a commodity others will happily buy and sell. Earnest mistakes sit beside them. A pattern in the mud that looked carved but was just a root. A cache of coins that turned out to be from a shipwreck, unrelated to the legend. Inspiration and exploitation share a thin boundary when old stories meet modern appetites. Myth versus record deserves a clean comparison. On one side sit texts that confirm the era's upheaval, the movement of valuables for safekeeping, and the existence of convoys under pressure. On the other sit credible witnesses, captains, clerks, judges, whose assertions, if independent, would weave into a firm rope. Between them drift later storytellers who embroidered truth with color. Attested, Peru's 1820-1821 crisis generated real transfers of sacred and state wealth. Some shipments vanished from official view. Contested, specific serial links tying that wealth to one ship whose crew mutinied and buried an entire cathedral's worth of treasure on a particular island. Legend, any retelling that introduces dramatic tokens, a skull rock, a perfect map with a single tree, a curse that strikes searchers without documents, older than the storytellers themselves. The sober, most plausible narrative respects both parts. There likely was a wartime transfer. There may have been theft and concealment. A remote island makes genuine sense as a temporary cache. Some items may yet lie beneath earth or coral, and the missing proof is just believable enough to keep the chase alive. Safety, ethics, and the sea place the final frame. Storms rise fast. Cliffs crumble where they look solid. Snakes and insects carry dangers that ignore courage. And disease finds a foothold in any group that underestimates the climate. Untrained digs risk collapse, injury, and the loss of context that turns an artifact into a puzzle piece with its edges filed off. Ethical handling of sacred items, if found, would demand quiet, respect for descendant communities and church authorities, and the slow reconciliation of law and sentiment. A chalice is not simply a cup that happens to be made of gold. It is an object that held meaning over generations. The sea and the forest have long memories. The people connected to those objects do as well. If the treasure were found tomorrow, who would own it, and what would change? Legal pathways branch. Claims by the Peruvian state, claims by the church for sacred objects, claims by finders under contract, and international agreements governing cultural property. Museums would argue for stewardship to preserve and share. Private sale would shrink as a viable option, the more specific the object's identity. Diplomatic conversations would follow quickly, because treasure does not appear in a vacuum. It steps into a world of relationships and prior agreements. The legend itself would not die with discovery. It would simply change shape. The open question would turn into contested evidence, and every item brought to light would invite stories about how it traveled in the first place. Closing this arc returns to the hook. A wartime transfer, a mutiny, and a plausible island stop that grew into a century-spanning chase. The power of the treasure endures because parts of the story are verifiable, and the missing parts are just believable enough. Maps, myths, and modern instruments continue to circle the same green dots and shadowed coves. The sea keeps its own counsel, and so do the rainforests. The clear takeaway is steady. The treasure of Lima remains a phantom fortune, not because it is false, but because it sits exactly where fact and possibility touch. The final question goes to the viewer. Is the fortune more valuable as a mystery that funds dreams, or as artifacts locked behind glass, catalogued and quiet? The legend now opens wider, not to raise the volume, but to lower the heart rate and bring details into focus. The cargo, whether imagined in a single dreamlike chest or in the real geometry of crates and ledger lines, keeps returning for one reason. It sits where wealth and meaning overlap. A child can grasp that difference. Coins sparkle, but calluses and reliquaries carry stories that generations held close. When rumor says such objects moved under duress and then vanished, the mind does not chase price alone. It chases the feeling that something important slipped off the stage during a quick scene change and never returned for its bow. Quick fact: sacred art in the colonial Andes often married European metalsmithing with local artistry. That cultural fusion is part of what makes the imagined inventory feel singular rather than generic. In the background stands a real crisis. The years 1820 and 1821 in Peru brought the kind of pressure that turns plans to steam. Forces aligned for independence. The old authorities, suddenly counting days rather than decades, made practical choices. Move assets, hold strong points, negotiate where possible. A harbor like Callao was not just a map point. It was a pressure cooker, where clerks with good handwriting met soldiers with tired boots. That is the precise climate in which valuables change hands legitimately, hurriedly, or in the shadows. Myth check: valuables moved from Lima to Lao for safekeeping during the political shift. Attested: a single perfectly tallied shipment later called the Treasure of Lima, with a tidy theatrical manifest. Contested: a calm accounting begins there and refuses to sprint. Popular retellings give the vessel a name: the Mary Deer. Some narratives attach a captain's name as well, sketching a man caught between duty and sudden opportunity. In the script that most viewers have heard, guards came aboard, the hold filled with church plate and jewels, and a neutral flag promised safe passage, while cannons around the harbor glared at one another across the water. Then the hinge swings. A mutiny. Guards murdered. Officers overpowered. The ship veers away from its stated path. A whispered island enters the frame, a place out of regular lanes where fresh water runs, and thick greenery hides footpaths by afternoon if men cut them in the morning. The cargo is said to be buried, the spot marked in ways that later readers love: skull-shaped boulders, a tree that leans like a pointing finger, a creek with a bend like a question mark. The return to sea ends badly in most versions: capture, trials, executions, and the last tool of a doomed crewman: information. Spare me, and I will guide you to it. That promise, whether spoken or invented by later pens, is the voice that still echoes over 2 centuries. A map moment helps with the geometry. A ship clearing Callao and choosing not to face a gauntlet of ports might angle for the sweep of current and wind that lifts a hull northwest into open Pacific. Out there, small green islands punctuate an oceanic expanse, volcanic, rain-wrapped, hard to reach, easy to leave if a captain wants a quick cash and a quick departure. Some of these islands now wear the protections of national parks and marine reserves. On paper they look like dots. On the ground they are steep, grooved by water, and armored with roots. Trails that seem clear at dawn vanish under mist. and a day's honest work can be undone by a single night of heavy rain. The inventory. Always the inventory. Lists that have charmed listeners for decades mention everything from gemmed statues to neat stacks of bars. A measured approach separates what rings true from what rings theatrical, true to period. Altars worked in precious metals, processional crosses, candlesticks, chalices, reliquaries, and bullion in forms meant for counting and transport. Less likely in bulk. Life-size solid figures made of gold. A single large reliquary can be tricky enough to move without scandal. A towering effigy carved entirely of precious metal strains, both physics and parish budgets. Heads up on this. Even high-value sacred objects could be surprisingly light for their size, since hollow construction achieved grandeur without impossible weight. But a dozen crates of gold and silver plate still add up to back-breaking labor once the shouts end, and only shovels remain. Translating all of this into modern value requires restraint. People love numbers with many zeros. Headlines love them even more. Yet museums do not price meaning the way markets price metal. When curators say priceless, the word does not mean beyond calculation for auctioneers. It means not for sale, because it anchors identity. Viewers who picture a reliquary in a glass case do not imagine a bidding paddle. They imagine quiet. They imagine a label that tells a story. That response is why the legend feels different than a tale about loose coins alone. The treasure of Lima, in the imagination, is not merely spendable. It is returnable, restorable, and arguable. Those temperaments, spend, return, argue, shape the modern hunt as surely as any tide. Documents, dispatches, and claims are the skeleton under this legend's skin. Clergy kept inventories, colonial administrators kept correspondence, courts recorded proceedings, captains kept logs, with the patience of men who knew that a forgotten line could become a ruinous misunderstanding. Over time, collectors gathered copies, families saved letters, and archives breathed the cool, steady air over paper that might otherwise have turned to dust. The trouble is not the absolute absence of paper. It is the unevenness and the way late documents sometimes lean too perfectly toward the exciting version. The careful path through this forest of pages treats early dull entries like gold and late dramatic paragraphs like silver, still precious, but not as decisive. Myth check, early inventory evidence for objects protected during the crisis. Attest, a continuous paper chain from a specific cathedral shelf to a specific ship's deck, and then to a specific jungle hollow. Contested. Searchers arrived in waves. The earliest had nothing but rumors and the human urge to test them. They hired small vessels, eyed the weather, and came ashore with shovels and hope. Some returned with nothing but stories of beautiful waterfalls and stubborn ground. Others swore heavily weathered coins turned up in the roots of trees. A pattern formed. Hope, spade, trench, rain, silence. A newer kind of seeker eventually appeared. The resident. This figure did not come for a season but for years. He lived where he searched. He learned that mornings mattered for climbing, because afternoons belonged to storms. He learned where wind sounded different, because a ridge opened a gap small enough to funnel the air into a voice. He planted small gardens, built a hut that the next storm would rearrange, and wrote letters that grew from excited to steady to philosophical. One of these residents became a kind of emblem. He was not the first to imagine treasure under his boots, but he was the one willing to be patient enough to let the island teach him. Accounts say he secured permission from authorities for a kind of concession. He mapped, he dug, he endured. Over long years he found small objects, including coins whose dates and origins provide conversation, but not definitive proof. Attested, a resident searcher on a famous rain-wrapped island recovered scattered coins over a long period. Contested, whether those coins point to the specific shipment that tradition calls the treasure of Lima. The humble objects, though, matter for another reason. They prove human presence. They prove campfires, small repairs, and ordinary loss. the kind that sends a coin through a hole in a pocket to wait in the leaf litter for the next century. Entangled legends arrived on the same winds as the first map sellers. Other captains, other decades, other dramatic hideaways grew vines into this lattice. The island, most often named for the Lima treasure, already attracted stories about pirates, with names that sound invented but belong to a historical soup of aliases and exaggerated reputations. The overlap makes sense. The same geography that tempts a mutinous crew to make a quick cash tempts a hard-pressed raider to do the same. Yet a good mental habit saves confusion here. Separate the claims by their earliest appearance in writing, by their geography, and by the nature of their cargo. Some likely share coves, but not dates. Some likely share dates but not islands. Distill them and the picture clarifies. A viewer can enjoy a knot of legends without tugging the ends together unnecessarily. The 20th century lifted the hunt into modern celebrity. Newspapers, radio, and then the glow of television loved the combination of remote beauty and the possibility of wealth. Wealthy hobbyists outfitted yachts. Expedition leaders posed with crates of equipment. Crews stared into cameras beside tunnels that needed to be shored before the next rain carried them away. The map industry matured too. Flea markets, waterfront shops, and private dealers offered charts browned at the edges, smeared with the sort of appealing grime that often seems too artful to be real. Quick fact: authentic working charts of the era obsess over depth soundings and coastal hazards. They do not pause for decorative skulls or cartoon arrows. The difference is obvious to a trained eye and useful even to a casual viewer. When a chart wants to be a movie poster, skepticism becomes an anchor. Technology entered like a new crewmate, strong, disciplined, and still learning the boat. Sonar swept shelves and steep slopes. Magnetometers murmured over concealed metal. ROVs descended where divers could not safely go. LiDAR modeled the surface, subtracting foliage to reveal terraces, trenches, and the patient handwriting of landslides across decades. Each tool carries strengths and blind spots. On steep volcanic terrain, magnetometers sing to minerals that are not treasure at all. Sonar reads boulder fields like broken chests. LiDAR reveals a grid of low walls built not by mutineers but by gardeners who tried their luck against poor soil. Case studies taught sobering lessons. One team pursued a magnetic anomaly that later proved to be a long natural seam in the rock, an honest geologic trick. Another drilled into a promising cavity that turned out to be the root ball of a fallen giant. Tech did not fail. Expectation did. That distinction keeps the conversation both hopeful and grounded. Law and permits define the playable board. Remote islands famous for biodiversity and cultural lore now carry layers of protection, national park status, marine reserve boundaries, even World Heritage distinctions that bring international eyes to local rules. This is not an obstacle course designed to stop romance. It is a framework to prevent damage. Digging without permission invites both legal trouble and the destruction of context. Context is more fragile than wood. It includes the exact depth at which an item lay, the soil around it, the pollen trapped nearby, the micro remains that tell a conservator what happened between the day something was buried and the day it was found. Properly recovered, an object keeps its story. Improperly seized, it becomes mute metal. Serious seekers know this, and in many cases, become amateur stewards of a place they once approached only as a rumor with coordinates. Competing theories still split the coffeehouse debates. The island vault view remains strong because it fits the logic of heat. A crew that just made itself notorious cannot parade crates through a mainland port without attracting eyes. A short sail to a quiet shore buys time. The mainland cache view stands too because it offers long-term safety. Caves above floodlines, monasteries with cellars inside thick walls, haciendas loyal to a cause that might change its uniform tomorrow. Both theories wrestle with weight and time. Imagine a crate of silver plate. Even if men can lift it, they must also carry it across mud, upslope, over roots, and into concealment, deep enough to escape the first sweep of a suspicious patrol. Imagine an effigy covered in gems. It cannot be jostled like a bag of beans. It demands form-fitting effort at exactly the moment when the crew most wishes to hurry. The likely compromise scenario has always been simple. Bury the most compact, most valuable, and most damning items first. Mark the place. Leave. Survive. Plan to return with more hands when danger ebbs. The world, however, does not always give second chances. Storms, patrols, disease, and ordinary mortality keep schedules no one sees from the deck. Counting the fortune means counting backs, hours, and distances. Not only coins. A small team can dig fast in soft ground, slower in root-woven soil, and not at all in stone without tools that make a noise no cautious mutineer wants to make. A safe pit needs depth, drainage, and a lid strong enough to resist animals and weather, which means wood or stone, and therefore more weight to move on the worst night. A realistic timeline for hiding even a fraction of a grand shipment runs to many hours and likely several nights. The window between mutiny and capture, if the capture accounts hold water, compresses those hours. That compression both prunes the legend to believable size and sharpens its tension. The story does not need a buried cathedral. It needs a buried selection. The more credible picture is a cache that made sense under pressure. Small, concentrated, and chosen by the hard math of survival. Culture and commerce will always circle such a tale. There is no shame in tours that point toward a cove, while guides tell the story with pride in place. There is no harm in paperbacks that let readers drift to sleep with sea spray in the imagination. The problem arrives when the promise of the perfect clue becomes a product rather than a possibility. Red flags are easy to remember. A discovery announced with theatrical flair, but without coordinates, without documentation, and without independent verification, asks for trust without payment. A map with immaculate calligraphy and an X that happens to sit at the center like a sun on a child's drawing, asks the mind to switch off the part that does geometry. A diary that reads like a screenplay rather than like a weathered notebook deserves admiration for its style and a careful pause before anyone buys a plane ticket. A clean comparison helps the mind breathe. On the attested shelf sit the crisis in Peru, the movement of valuables through Lima and Callao for protection, the use of neutral vessels to avoid obvious conflict, and the stubborn long-term interest in a particular rain-swept island because it fits practical criteria for a quick cash. On the contested shelf sit the exact contents and weight of a single shipment, the precise names and roles of mutineers, the full authenticity of maps that emerged decades after the alleged burial, and the argument that a single team had the time and manpower to hide the whole of what newspaper imagination later inflated. On the legend shelf sit skull rocks, curses, and lines of poetic dialogue that appear for the first time in books designed to delight rather than to document. The shelves do not fight each other. They support a single room. In that room, a viewer can stand and feel both the solidity of history and the warmth of possibilities. Safety and ethics form the hand that steadies the shoulder before anyone takes a step off a dock. Islands that look gentle from a distance break ankles up close. Cliffs shed stones without warning. Snakes and insects carry venom and illness without ceremony. The sea, on a good day, tolerates human plans. On a bad day, it ends them. Untrained digs kill, and trained digs sometimes do too, because geology prefers silence to instruction. The ethical part is as clear as the safety part. If sacred objects do exist beneath leaves and loam, they are not simply prizes. They are pieces of human life that once stood in places people loved and feared. Their treatment, if recovered, deserves the same gravity that their imagined hiding inspires. That principle is not an ornament to the story, it is the keel that keeps it upright. Imagine, for a moment, that a team tomorrow uncovers a cache that meets enough tests to be called authentic by serious people. The first change would be in the conversations, not in bank accounts. Who owns what emerges? The nation from which the objects came? The church that once used them? The state whose park preserved them? The investor group that paid for the expedition? International agreements exist to navigate those arguments, and none erase tension. Museums would make a case for stewardship and public access. Churches would remind listeners that some objects were never meant to be owned in the commercial sense at all. Governments would balance pride, law, and diplomatic goodwill. A quieter but profound change would ripple through scholarship. The treasure of Lima would move from hypothetical case study to provenance puzzle. Each item would ask a question the jungle could not answer. Where, exactly, did it begin its life, and how did it travel under duress? That is not the end of romance. It is the beginning of responsibility. Now the narrative turns the glass in the hand, so light hits different facets. The enduring pull of this legend comes from its balance. Too flimsy, and it would have crumbled. Too neat, and it would have resolved. Instead, it offers a hard core of history, wrapped in a mist of possibility. That is why it welcomes modern methods without being conquered by them. Sonar maps are beautiful. They do not guarantee epiphanies. Magnetometers hum with clues. They also hum with geology. LiDAR paints bare earth on screens. It cannot tell a mutineer's hand from a gardener's a century later. And yet, in each pass, tools give gifts. They eliminate squares on the grid. They replace maybe everywhere with not here. That subtraction, over time, is its own kind of discovery. A slow walk through the island theory's strongest points rewards patience. First, a remote, water-rich island offers concealment that does not require intricate human alliances on shore. Second, the time needed for a basic cache, hours, not weeks, fits the stress window after a mutiny. Third, the risk of talking mouths multiply in ports. On an island, the circle of knowledge is the circle of shovels. Fourth, return logistics are simple and perilous at once. Simple because the place is fixed and secret. Perilous because weather and surveillance erase certainty. Against those strengths, the island theory carries weaknesses. Heavy, bulky items may never have reached a secure depth before capture. Markers, trees, oddly shaped rocks change or deceive. A crew coming back months later can step into a valley and feel like strangers. A slow walk through mainland scenarios builds another set of strengths. A monastery sympathetic to a cause might secure sacred objects in cellars with thickness no spade can match. A hacienda with loyal labor could scatter crates among legitimate stores. Caves above floodlines hold steady temperatures and quiet dryness. Against those strengths, weak points appear. Moving bulky crates inland demands visible caravans or stealthy small parties making multiple trips. Both risky when authorities are attentive and neighbors gossip freely. A treasure becomes safer from nature but riskier from people. The most sober synthesis continues to favor a hybrid. An emergency cache offshore, a longer plan ashore for any faction that had the time and friends to attempt it. The human factor might be the most underrated part of the story. Greed drives many narratives, but exhaustion drives decisions. Mutiny, murder, and theft do not occur on crews that slept well and enjoyed simple days. They occur on decks where tempers and fears mixed for weeks. Men in that state bury what they can, not what a romantic novelist would have them bury. They think of water first, cover second, the sky third. A viewer picturing a crew pausing to arrange a chest perfectly under a tree for an artist's eye can relax that image. The likely scene is hurried, dirty, full of arguments about where the line from the creek to the rock was supposed to intersect the memory of a certain route. Those human slips may be exactly why no one has stood on a spot and said, without debate, here. Maps belong in this calm analysis, but they need to be seen as artifacts of belief, as much as evidence of fact. A genuine working chart from the right era, with annotations that make a navigator's sense, is interesting long before any X is considered. A sheet of paper made to please treasure hunters first and to guide ships second is a souvenir, not a witness. Many of the most thrilling treasure maps would be useless on a rainy night. With a tired crew, the most useful would look boring to a collector. Angles from a headland, Notes about a tree that no longer stands. Details about a creek bend that a landslide has since straightened. That is not a flaw in the island. It is a lesson about time. The jungle edits maps with a quiet style that resists nostalgia. The climate writes the legend's punctuation. On some oceanic islands, rain falls not as weather, but as personality. It begins soft and honest, turns insistent after lunch, and occasionally throws a performance that rearranges soil and memory overnight. Trails become rivulets. Rivulets become temporary streams, and the ground under a boot goes from trustworthy to sly in a dozen steps. A cache, placed above what looked like the high water line in a dry month, might sit under a new seasonal stream. The next year, that water steals not only soil, but scent. It erases the chemistry that dogs and humans sometimes use to track disturbance. Viewers who imagine an untouched landscape forget that untouched is the wrong word. The landscape is touched constantly by rain, gravity, and roots. It is human memory that is fragile. When the narrative returns to value, it chooses a less glamorous vocabulary on purpose. Value is not only the sum of metal, it is the sum of time that would be spent to retrieve, conserve, and interpret the objects in a way that honors their origin. A bar of gold might go from ground to display in a year. A gilded reliquary, pried apart and reassembled by an impatient hand, might sit in a conservation lab for a decade before a curator would dare to present it to the public. The cost of that labor is part of the arithmetic. Museums do that math slowly. Investors sometimes do it quickly. Governments do it with other columns on the sheet. Tourism, national pride, international obligations that change the sign on numbers from plus to minus, or back again, depending on the meeting. All of those spreadsheets, visible or invisible, are why the prospect of discovery now feels as complex as it does exciting. Throughout, the tone of this exploration stays steady because panic and certainty both mislead. Panic rushes that collapses trenches and friendships. Certainty leaps from a coincidence to a conclusion because it is tired of ambiguity. A steady tone gives the mind room to ask better questions. What would a crew in that exact weather choose to move first? What would a captain with a wounded conscience prefer to destroy rather than risk losing in a trial? Which objects would attract attention instantly in a port? Which would pass as dull cargo if disguised? Slow questions often outperform fast shovels. Now the story folds back to where it began, not to repeat itself, but to close its circles. A city in crisis hurried sacred and royal wealth into motion. A ship under a neutral flag offered what looked like safety. A crew found a different path. A remote island promised water and secrecy, and a cache there remains compatible with human behavior and geography. A paper trail confirms parts of that path. It does not draw an unbroken line through the jungle to a specific hollow. Early searchers established a rhythm of hope, effort, and quiet return. Long-term residents, more humble and more observant, contributed observations that shaped how maps are read today. Technology entered as a careful ally, increasing clarity without defeating complexity. Laws stood guard for culture and for land and sea. Theories divided into island and mainland, and a patient synthesis explained why both have adherents. The arithmetic of weight, hours, and risk trimmed romantic excess and made the most plausible picture more vivid, not less. If a viewer has held the legend gently this long, the final steps will feel familiar and still new. The treasure of Lima remains a phantom fortune, not because it lives only in fantasy, but because the lattice of fact around it is strong enough to hold the weight of imagination without snapping. The sea helps by erasing footprints. The rain helps by editing trails. Time helps by blurring names without dissolving motives. The legend's power is its half visibility. It shows enough to respect. It hides enough to compel. Closing means honoring both possible endings. If no cache is ever found, the story continues to pay for boats, documentaries, museum exhibits, and the schooling of minds that learn by chasing one mystery, how to handle others. If a cache is found, the story will shift from promise to argument. Lawyers, curators, diplomats, and parish councils will sit at tables, and the public will see not only the gold, but also the process by which culture decides what to do with gold. Either way, the legend endures because it has outgrown the single moment that started it. It has become a reflection on how humans treat objects that matter under pressure. The hook that opened this journey still holds. As Lima reeled, a convoy's sacred gold and jewels vanished. A mutinous crew whispered of an island vault. 2 centuries later, maps, myth, and modern tech still chase a fortune no one can prove or dismiss. The takeaway is as clear as sea air at dawn. The parts that can be verified keep the story tethered to Earth. The parts that remain plausible keep it airborne at the same time. That balance explains why so many gentle obsessions, historians with pencils, divers with patience, rangers with keys, and viewers with quiet evenings, continue to give this legend a long life. The final invitation turns the lens outward. The viewer knows by now that any resolution will be complicated, so the question stands calmly. Is the fortune more valuable as a mystery that funds dreams, field notes and careful maps, or as artifacts locked behind glass, catalogued and quiet, their meaning settled at last?